Good afternoon, Fantasy Bay. Mike Williams here, and today we're going to be going over the studs and duds for Week 9. I apologize for my voice. I've lost it over the weekend, but I'm here for you, the people. So here we go. Let's get it started. All right, Russell Wilson played like a beast. We knew he had a great game going against Tampa. Our passing defense is pretty terrible. And Russell Wilson is a beast. Right now, he's arguably one of the top runners for MVP this year. Man, 49 fantasy points, 5 touchdowns, 378 yards. Gotta love that. And he gave you 21 rushing yards on the ground. Absolutely beastly. Next, we're going to talk about Jimmy G, Mr. GQ himself. He got 36 fantasy points this week, 300 yards, 4 touchdowns. I love the connection between him and Emmanuel Sanders. This offense, it seems like it's starting to click. They were playing Arizona, but still, I do like how great they looked. I think Jimmy G might be a great option moving forward. Alrighty, now let's go to Matthew Stafford. Now, last week he was heating up. Two good weeks in a row. 36, 29. Man, if we're playing beer pong rules, if he hits this week, he's on fire. So 31 points, I consider that a hit. Matthew Stafford is on fire. I'm playing him. 400 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns. Absolutely fantastic. He's had 3, and 4 touchdowns in the last 3 games. You love to see that. He's slinging it down the field, back to his old ways. Love to see that from Matthew Stafford. I think he's going to be very good moving forward. Lamar Jackson is a beast. He said, Patriots who? Tom what? 30 fantasy points. He only had 163 yards passing, but everybody knows my man gets his stuff on the ground. He had 61 yards from 16 attempts. He had 2 rushing touchdowns and a passing touchdown. My man is well-rounded. Obviously a start moving forward. Ryan Fitzpatrick. I would sing it, but I can't. Sorry, guys. 29 fantasy points this week. 288 yards, 3 touchdowns. Gave you 3 of them things. I'm telling you, Fitzmagic is a gunslinger. He can go off for a good game. You always got to watch out for him in a good matchup. Next, we're going to be talking about Dak Prescott. 27 fantasy points against the Giants. 3 touchdowns. Not bad at all. I like Dak Prescott. He's been playing great this year. Averaging 22.8 fantasy points a game. That's 4th on the year. Gotta love that. All right. Kyler Murray, the rookie sensation, coming out firing. 26 fantasy points. I'm happy to see him bounce back for those last 2 poor games. 26 fantasy points is very solid. 2 passing touchdowns. 34 yards rushing. Kyler Murray is a dual-threat quarterback, and I think he's going to be relevant moving forward, as is tradition. Kirk Cousins has been playing great. Even last game when he only had 11 points, he played well. But this game, he finally got the touchdowns. Touchdowns in fantasy football matter so much more than yards. It's amazing. He had 3 touchdowns. That's 18 points right there. He had 26 fantasy points. Kirk Cousins is fantastic. I like him moving forward. Some more also mentions. Jameis Winston, 24. Ryan Tannehill, 24. Deshaun Watson, 23. And Derek Carr, 23. All right, let's move over to the wide receiver position. And Tyler Lockett came to play. Man, did he look great. 40 fantasy points. He had 13 receptions off of 18 targets. That's fantastic. I cannot believe they threw him the ball that many times. Josh Gordon coming back, I think, reins that in a little bit. But I still think he stays the number 1 receiver in this offense. He's fantastic. He's fast, and he has great hands, and he can toe tap with the best of them. Love it. Next, Mike Evans. Let's go, Bucks. Finally. Actually, not finally. He played well last week, but we may have lost the game, guys. But there's some potential with these wide receivers, and I love our run defense, so I'm very pleased. Mike Evans came in with 36 fantasy points. He had 12 receptions, 180 yards, and a touchdown. That's absolutely amazing. Mike Evans is a beast. DK Metcalf, 2 players from the top 3 from the same team. DK Metcalf, 26 fantasy points. He had 9 targets, 6 receptions, 123 yards, and a touchdown. You love to see that. I think DK Metcalf may take a slight tick back due to Josh Gordon joining the team, but I still think he's going to be a touchdown threat. He's strong, he's big, and he can run in a straight line very well and catch. Marvin Jones has been balling. 26 fantasy points, 10 targets, 8 receptions, 126 yards, and a touchdown. Absolutely beastly. Tyreek Hill, 26 fantasy points. He had 6 receptions, 140 yards, and a touchdown. Love it. Preston Williams, before he got injured, had 24 fantasy points, 5 receptions, 72 yards, and 2 of them things. Mohamed Sanu, Tom Brady's new favorite toy, 24 fantasy points, 10 receptions off of 14 targets. You love to see that. 81 yards and a touchdown. Mohamed Sanu is a must-add. Emmanuel Sanders came through with some points. Thank goodness with the new Jimmy GQ. 24 fantasy points, 7 receptions, 112 yards, and a touchdown. Fantastic. Some also mentions were Kenny Golladay at 23, Jamison Crowder 22, Zach Pascal 18, DeAndre Hopkins 18, and Amari Cooper with 18. All right, next we're going to be going to the running back position. Christian McCaffrey is a monster. He is also fighting for an MVP type race. 37 fantasy points. He had 146 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, 3 receptions, 20 yards, and a receiving touchdown. He's an absolute monster. Obviously, he's a must start every game because he's a beast. Let's go to next. Kenyon Drake came out firing against San Francisco. Everybody was talking about how terrible of a game it would be for him, how great the defense was going to lock him down. 28 fantasy points. He had 15 attempts for 110 yards and a touchdown, 4 receptions for 52 yards. Absolutely fantastic. Kenyon Drake, Drizzy is in the house, and he is balling. I think that this starts to go away once David Johnson comes back, and I believe David Johnson comes back this year, but this Drake might be a one-hit wonder until David Johnson gets injured again. Melvin Gordon finally has himself a great game. 25 fantasy points. He had 20 attempts, 80 rushing yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns. And to go along with that, he had 3 receptions for 29 yards. Well-rounded. Now, I don't think that they're going to be dominating games like they did the Packers this week. But you know what? Game script was in his favor. He played very well. I hope he does this moving forward. I'm wondering what this does to Austin Eckler, but I still think that they're both pretty viable for now. Josh Jacobs, my man, 24 fantasy points, 120 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns. Love to see that. Derrick Henry, 24 fantasy points, 63 yards on the ground and a touchdown. And then he had a receiving touchdown with 3 receptions. Love to see that. Devin Singletary, 22 fantasy points, 95 yards and a touchdown with 45 receiving yards. Love that. David Montgomery stays relevant. 14 attempts, 22 fantasy points, 2 touchdowns, 40 yards. Not bad at all. Love that. Damian Williams finally comes back. He had like a 91-yard run, which definitely pads these stats, but those points count. 125 yards on the ground and a touchdown, as well as 12 attempts on the ground. He had 12 attempts and had 125 yards. That's 10 yards an attempt. That's amazing. Some also mentions. Actually, I don't have any also mentions here. Keep it moving. Tight ends. Zach Ertz finally has a game. Goodness gracious. He's been playing terrible all year, but he had 25 fantasy points, 9 receptions off of 11 targets, 103 yards, and a touchdown. Love to see him come back. Good for you, Zach. Noah Fant is coming through in the clutch. 20 fantasy points against Cleveland. He had 3 receptions for 115 yards and a touchdown off of a great run. George Kittle came out firing, 19 fantasy points, 6 receptions, 79 yards, and a touchdown. Kittle looks great. Hopefully he's not too injured and he can play this week. Jacob Hollister from Seattle, 19 fantasy points, 4 receptions, 37 yards, but he had 2 of them things. Hunter Henry, 15 fantasy points, 7 receptions off of 10 targets. I love how involved he is. 84 yards, 15 fantasy points is great. Same with Mike Gesicki, 6 receptions, 6 targets. My man went 6 for 6 for 15 fantasy points, 95 yards. Love that. Vance McDonald had 14. Jason Witten had 13. Defenses that blew up. Houston had 22 fantasy points. 4 sacks, 2 picks. Love that. Cowboys, 21 fantasy points, 5 sacks, 1 pick, 2 fumble recoveries, and a touchdown. Oh, I forgot about the 2 fumble recoveries for Houston. My bad. Steelers had played great, 20 fantasy points. They had a touchdown, 2 fumble recoveries, and an interception to go along with 5 sacks. Wow, that's amazing. Goodness. Baltimore Ravens, 16 fantasy points. They had 2 sacks, 1 pick, 1 fumble recovery, and a touchdown. Damn, there's a lot of touchdowns going on over here. Panthers, 14 fantasy points. Bills, 11. Very solid. All right, now let's get to the duds. Unfortunately, where there are studs, there are duds that hurt your fantasy team. Gardner Minshew played very bad against Houston. Enough to where they said Nick Foles is going to be our starter when he comes back. He had 9 fantasy points. He did have 300 passing yards, but in fantasy football, it all comes down to the touchdowns, and he had none of those. All right, Aaron Rodgers. Now, he's not a true bust because he had 14 fantasy points, so he was okay. But Aaron Rodgers coming off of 22, 53, 32, 14. Let's be honest, you were a little disappointed. Tom Brady, game, 15 fantasy points. Y'all saw what happened against Baltimore. Now, these are some true duds. These duds will make you sad. Stephon Diggs. Can I dig it? Can you dig it, Stephon Diggs? Can you dig it? Because you were digging your own grave last week. 2 points. He had 4 targets, 1 reception. He had a couple deep targets that he just missed on that would have made his day, but he missed on them. So I'm not burying Stephon Diggs. He's been coming off of some fantastic games. 42 fantasy points, 21 fantasy points, 20 yardage, 167, 142, 143. He's been playing fantastic. So I'm not too upset about him. Let's get to Keenan Allen. 7 fantasy points. Very disappointing. He has not been playing well these last few games. Actually, going back for a bit now, he's averaging 9.3 fantasy points this year. That's 22nd. That is not what you signed up for. I don't know how many of you were starting Robbie Anderson, but 5 fantasy points is pretty trash. Christian Kirk had 2 fantasy points. Awful. All right, let's get to the running backs. Frank Gore, 1 point. Absolutely awful. LaShawn McCoy, 1 point. Man, he is hard to predict, and don't even know if I can call him up and down anymore. 6, 9, 9, 1. Is 9 really up? Anyways. Royce Freeman, 2 fantasy points. God, awful. He was consistent for a while there, 12, 16, 11, but 2 fantasy points, terrible. Sony Michel, I'm sure this hurt a lot of you. 3 fantasy points. Man, 18 yards, 1 reception, awful. Aaron Jones, after coming off of a 40-point game, my man has 4 points, 8 attempts, 30 yards, awful. Tevin Coleman, also coming off of a fantastic game. Can't bench this guy. He just dropped 37. How could you possibly bench him? He had 4 touchdowns last week. 5 fantasy points. Awful. 23 rushing yards on the ground. Absolutely terrible. Mark Walton, a lot of people thought he was going to come in and do work. 6 fantasy points. All right, let's get to the tight end. Mark Andrews. Rough. 4 fantasy points. For somebody that started off so hot, he has been trending downward these last couple games. Darren Waller had himself a meh game, 7 fantasy points. Jonnu Smith, 4 points. Eric Ebron, he's going to be hit or miss on those touchdowns. He had 3 points. Greg Olsen, meh, 7 fantasy points. He had 3 receptions, 40 yards. That's okay for a tight end. Dallas Goedert, 7 fantasy points. 4 receptions. I like to see that. 39 yards. And Darren Fells, he is touchdown dependent, 7 points. Jimmy Graham, 5 fantasy points. Now that's going to do it for the studs and duds for week 9. If you have any questions, hit me up. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out my social media down below. Fantasy Bay, I'm out.